right here.
Okay. Councillor Wood.
Oh, yeah, thank you. Just in relation to this slide you had up there, the interim guidance for March 2015, first bullet point there, it supports objective of neighbourhoods containing quality affordable homes, but does not support intervention in the housing market through prices and home ownership. Can you give me a bit more of a understanding of that? Is that a kind of that they won't get into the economic aspects of this matter of housing?
John, just before we go down, probably Councillor Wood, the same kind of issue applies as, you know, in the same response we gave to Councillor Casey. What we're doing is simply noting a very pared back version of the interim guidance from the panel. It is on their website to read through in depth. I guess what the staff are doing is just giving us like an aide de memoire. What are the key things that the panel was saying? So, you know, you can get that in a bit more depth. But Chloe, did you want to add anything briefly on this?
I guess just to say that the panel was definitely more focused on the idea that supply would help to address those effects, and we're less convinced that having policies that provide for intervention through requiring a certain level of affordable housing in terms of proportion, or retained affordable housing, or getting into the levels of what incomes and proportions, that sort of detail they were less comfortable with. And I think where it was left really at the RPS was, well, there was a lot more convincing that needed to be done at the next layer down. I just raised a few questions about it.
And given that was a year ago, a lot more might have happened. Yeah. Mr. Baker.
Just a question in regards to the rural urban boundary and going to the district plan level. Does that mean that whether it's contiguous or separate by itself, does that mean that I guess the control of where things happen is more in the hands of independent panel, you know, commissioners, you know, when people apply for their plan change, and council setting the boundary as to where our growth's going to go? So it would just be pretty much, you want to do just apply, and we lose a little bit of control as to, you know, where we go. And so our urban form sort of thing, we know that compact city sort of, it seems to me contrary to their support of that.
It's probably slightly more complicated than that, because ultimately the council decides whether it's independent commissioners or councillors that sit on a hearing in the first place. We have a practice of and a policy of having independent commissioners, but that wouldn't have to be the case. So I guess the bigger issue is more it puts it through you know, a Section 32 analysis each time, submissions, a hearing, potentially appeals to the Environment Court. So it may be that a private plan change is rejected by the council, and then is appealed to the courts, and then it might be the courts who make decisions on the rural urban boundary. So it's a range of kind of different paths that it could take if it's at the district plan level. If it's in the RPS, it's locked in and it stays in the RPS unless the council agrees to shift the rub. But if it's at the district plan level, then private plan changes can go to hearings, they can be appealed, they can go to the court, and it's not just one. I think the biggest concern from a staff point of view is the fact that we've got no idea how many times that might happen. So, yeah, and a lot of resources would have to go into it.
If I could just add to that just briefly, one of the, I guess what the panel also said was there would be criteria set in the RPS that would need to be considered. So the council would essentially have control over the development of that criteria. So the effort needs to be made then on having a really strong, tight criteria to be able to maintain that control that you were referring to.
Okay. Councillor Webster.
Oh, just very quickly, Madam Chair. Serviced and unserviced villages, you're talking just water and wastewater. That's the definition.
Our definition is just wastewater.
Oh, is it? Not water?
No, as long as the wastewater service, they're categorised as a service village. That's definitely my recollection.
Yep.
That's how we defined them in the Auckland plan and also in the Unitary plan. Oh. So there are a few situations where they have
water tanks, but
no waste. I'm sorry. Could be nice. Wastewater, but no water supply.
I like Manly and Wongapari.
Yep. Councillor Quacks?
Just interim guidance from the panel in both 20th of March, the bullet point number 1, and but does not support intervention in the housing market, through prices and home ownership. I'm not quite sure if I understand that entirely. I understand the first part of it, but I don't understand those last few words, John. Maybe you should just elaborate on that a bit, because it doesn't seem to appear to make sense. Excuse me for saying that.
So in the rules that follow the regional policy statement, we had specific requirements for any development of more than, I think it was, say 10 dwellings, had to provide 10% of those dwellings at a certain price point that was based on the market average house price, I think it was at that time, and made available to people on incomes at, I think, 80% of the median income. It was those, so we had quite specific formulas in the rules that followed on from these statements in the RPS about exactly how many dwellings within a development had to be affordable. We defined that affordable based on incomes, which is the home and also home ownership. So in perpetuity, the houses had to be owned by people on a certain income. So that was the ownership part of it. Or a social housing provider would be the other alternative. And that those houses had to be continually sold at a certain price point. Now, I mean, it's a bit more complex than that, but if you get the gist of it, we had rules that were very specific about the prices, who could own them, and what incomes they were on.
So, John, you're really talking about inclusionary zoning, and that's what they've disagreed with, isn't it?
At that point in time, yep.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Okay, right, I think we should move on to economic wellbeing.
All right, so the second of the 8 chapters in the RPS deals with economic wellbeing. It has 3 sections, one dealing with commercial and industrial development, one dealing with, so this is where a lot of the infrastructure stuff sits in the RPS, and energy and transport. What do we have in the energy plan as notified? We had a focus of commercial activity, and that's office and retail in our metropolitan town and local centres, and also along certain identified major transport corridors. And that basically reflected the approach of the former regional council and the district city councils in Auckland. So there's nothing radically new in that approach. Focus on achieving a transport system that integrates with land use and a compact urban form, including transport choice. We had quite a focus on the importance of significant infrastructure, and a lot of discussion and debate and mediation on what the term significant infrastructure might mean. But that was the phrase that we had in the RPS. Recognition of locational and function-based requirements of that infrastructure to be in certain places. So there might be some sensitive parts of Auckland, but when you weigh that up with the importance of having critical, significant life-supporting infrastructure, then there may need to be some trade-offs. So that was recognised in this part of the RPS. And there was some guidance on how to manage the impacts of upgrading or providing that new infrastructure in sensitive areas like sensitive landscapes or ecological areas, heritage areas, for significant infrastructure. So that all sat in the second chapter of the RPS. The submissions, I mean, there was general support for the idea of office and retail development, mainly in centres, not popping up in industrial areas. So that was generally supported, although there was some opposition to that. Some submitters wanted more explicit statements about avoiding incompatible activities, i.e. residential or schools near existing industry. So some were saying we didn't have strong enough statements about protecting industry from those sensitive uses. Some of the retailers said that there are some types of retail in particular that aren't suitable for public transport, i.e. you can't carry your fridge on a bus very easily. So that old theme came up from submitters, and therefore the implication being that we should be a bit more freeing up of retail in industrial areas perhaps because of that. Amendments to the policy framework relating to reverse sensitivity effects. Sorry, I've moved on to the next one. Increase or maintain the level of protection for existing or proposed infrastructure. For example, the national grid, airports, power stations, motorways and the like. So that's where the submitters were coming from, generally speaking, in a bit of summary form. Council's position at the hearings, again, we supported the overall approach in this chapter here, particularly in terms of retail. We put a bit more detail in there in terms of establishing a network of centres and the differing roles of your larger metropolitan centres down to your local shopping centres. So we put a bit more detail in there. That's the second bullet point. We expanded on the idea of significant infrastructure to include the whole network, not just perhaps the bigger, bulkier parts of the network. So it became quite a broad definition of what significant infrastructure is. And there were some amendments proposed to the wording in the RPS around this reverse sensitivity issue of sensitive things like residential, schools and hospitals and their impacts on industry and infrastructure. And I guess the approach there was that the primary approach should be to avoid those impacts on existing significant infrastructure and industry, but if that's not possible, remedy and mitigate instead. So we had some guidance from the panel again. We didn't have guidance on all 8 chapters, but we did have guidance on this chapter here. The first bullet point is really just a structural issue. It's not a policy issue. They're just saying that there should have been a standalone chapter. One of the 8 chapters should have been just about infrastructure. So we had infrastructure as part of economic development. They were saying, no, it's important enough, and this was the infrastructure providers arguing for it. It should have its own chapter. Not a policy issue, as I said, more a structural issue. They preferred the definition in the RMA of infrastructure, and they didn't see the need to just talk about significant infrastructure in the RPS. So there were many days of mediation between council and infrastructure providers and others about this term significant infrastructure, and then we had the guidance from the panel saying, well, actually, they're not too fussed about the term significant. They feel that all infrastructure is pretty important. It's all interconnected. And that's kind of where we'd all got to anyway. So it was interesting to see the panel come up with this interim guidance. Social facilities, we mentioned this one before. They shouldn't have the same treatment as infrastructure. We weren't entirely clear what that interim guidance means. So it really wasn't that clear. They just said that they didn't feel that they should be treated the same, that they should be defined differently. And they did support the idea of allowing some forms of infrastructure to be in those more sensitive areas where there's basically a functional need for it to be there, that there's no other alternative. Operationally, it just has to go there, and so there has to be some balancing of the impacts on the environment and the benefits of the infrastructure, rather than saying, no, infrastructure cannot go in a sensitive ecological area ever. So there was some direction from the panel there that there needed to be a case-by-case assessment, and that was largely consistent with the council's approach. So still avoiding impacts on the first case, but if there's no other alternative, then how can you mitigate or minimise the impacts? So that's the guidance from the panel, and that's chapter 2 of the RPS.
Okay. Any
Chapter 3.
urgent questions? Let's more quickly. Oh, Councillor Quacks?
Yeah, we've identified 1,400 hectares, a minimum of 1,400 hectares as land going into the future. Do the panel or any submitters make any comments, John, on the amount of land available for commercial industrial use, whether it was too much, too little, or just about right? Any comment on that?
Don't believe there's any interim guidance on that issue of new industrial business land at all yet. Nothing from the panel yet.
Because, Madam Chair, just a comment, if I may. The economic section does seem to talk a lot about where stuff is placed and where so forth, but it actually doesn't seem to address the issue of whether the 1,400 hectares is enough or not enough or whatever. And I would have thought that might have been quite important, but clearly if the panel didn't think it was important, it isn't important.
I think, Madam Chair, the fact that they haven't given interim guidance doesn't mean to say it's not important. It just means that they didn't feel the need to give any direction. So one of the things to say at the start of any interim guidance is that that it shouldn't be read that because they're not making a statement it's not important, or that they don't have some issues. They just felt that there was a need to give guidance on some things but not others. So I don't think we can read that into it, to be honest.
Thanks, John.
Yep.